Hello friends, for today's video I want to do a new fantasy releases wrap up specifically for The Bright Sword, The Spellshop, and That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon. Quick heads up before I jump into it, it is a little stormy outside and my dog's not really afraid of storms, but she does seem a little unsettled right now, and maybe some of the neighbors' dogs might bark and then she might bark. Or she might pace the hallway and you might hear little tippy tappies, or she might go out the doggy door. I know most of you don't care. And Luna's so cute, whatever. Even just the idea that she's around, I think probably makes some of you happy, but I just want to give that heads up in case she makes noise at any point in the video. But on the topic of precious things, I'm going to start with The Spellshop. I did do an entire dedicated review for this one. It's non-spoiler, but it is more in-depth than what I'm going to touch on here. If you already watched it, obviously feel free to skip ahead. As always, I'll have timestamps in the description bar in case you'd like to go to any one specific book or reference back to them at a later point. And then I'll also have the books, in case they sound interesting, linked in the description bar. But this book is so cute. It's so cute. I feel like it's the perfect segue out of talking about Luna and into talking about books. If you like cozy fantasy, this one is probably going to fit the bill for you. I also find I enjoy cozy fantasy, but I also think that it is a little bit starting to become a trend, and I think that I fear that it's going to be one of those subgenres that we just start pumping out anything that can even remotely be considered cozy in hopes that people will check it out, and that we'll start to lose some of that charm that we've come to really love and expect from cozy fantasy, and that is not anything I think to worry about with this one. First off, Sarah Beth Durst, I think, always does a great job in establishing her settings. Second, her character, not just individual character development and arcs throughout the story, not only are those phenomenal, but I think the character relationship building is also really fantastic. She just has a way of pulling at your heart with the characters that she writes, and that was certainly true, I found, with this one as well. The setup for the story is that you follow a young woman named Keela and her sentient spider plant named Kaz. And at the very beginning of the story, Keela, a dedicated librarian, finds herself having to save some of her precious tomes when there is an attack that is leading to the destruction of the entire place that she's in. So she rescues some of the books and flees with her spider plant, and she doesn't really know where to go, and she finds herself just heading to the first place that comes to mind that she thinks makes sense, which is the very, very tiny island that she grew up on. A tiny island that, while she wants to remain basically hidden in her parents' old home, she does not find success in that whatsoever, because in typical sort of small town fashion, everybody looks out for everybody. They immediately notice that she's there, and they all feel the need to chip in and help out where they can. And she, in her mind, is thinking, I'm just here until this attack, the dust settles, and I can go back and I can bring these books back, and these books have really important magical information in them, so it's important that I saved them. But very quickly she's realizing that it can be perceived as theft, and that she is technically not supposed to have taken those books from the library. In her mind, she was just doing this heroic good deed, and also she can't let books burn. But she's realizing pretty quickly that she can't let anybody know that she has these books in her possession. However, she's also recognizing pretty quickly that she is not self-sufficient whatsoever. So she kind of begrudgingly accepts everybody's help, even though she's very antisocial and doesn't really want to talk to people, but she's learning how to navigate conversations. And she also finds that this particular island is not as she remembers it from her childhood. It has faced some tough times, including some of the ways in which the policies of the government have affected this place. I think that there are certainly themes that you can draw from that and how it relates to our own world, the ways in which small towns, villages, islands, just people in general, and entire ways of life can be disrupted because they get left behind, lost, and they fall through the cracks, and just some of the ways in which the land can be taken for what it's worth, and then we kind of forget about the people themselves, and just the way that land can be mistreated as well. I think that that's something that you could easily read the book and just not really think about those things and just enjoy the cuteness of it all. But for me, that's what made this especially shine, is that it had all the cuteness, and it had some of these things deeply within it as well, so I really appreciated that. I also thought Keela felt like a realistic, relatable character. She had some flaws to her. She did not always navigate relationships in a way that was the best, and you found her learning to grow and think about other people's needs and how she could be also a good neighbor, basically, to everyone else. There is also a sweet love story through it all, as well as sweet friendship building in this. But I have seen that this book is considered to be Sarah Beth Durst's fantasy romance debut, and I don't mind that categorization, or if other people want to call it that, that's fine. I'm not going to be up in arms about it, but I would not call it that. I personally did not think that this felt like a romance purely because I didn't think that the romance one as a subplot was actually that significant. It was there and it was present. It was very cute and very wholesome. However, it's not a driving factor in the story. So for me, I think calling it a fantasy romance is a little misleading, and I fear for the same reason when people don't know something's YA, they just know it's romance and they pick it up and then they're disappointed because it doesn't have spice. I fear that there's going to be a similar feeling because they're just going to hear, oh, it's a fantasy romance. They being people that are expecting that because of the marketing. And it is not that. It's not spicy whatsoever. It's just cute. And again, it's a subplot. It's not the main plot. There's so much with the world building. There's so much with the character development, with grief, with learning to be a part of a community, what even is home. I think that so many of those things are more so the focus, and the love story that exists within this is just a nice little cherry on top. But in general, though, I just wanted to give that heads up because, as we've discussed a number of times, I think with fantasy romance emerging as its own genre and being very popular, we still haven't quite figured out what is and isn't fantasy romance, and I'm not the one to decide, but I do think that people have certain expectations when they hear fantasy romance, and I just always want to ensure that people have the right expectations when they're getting into a book. I thought this book was fantastic. I thought it was so cute. Like I said, one of my new favorite cozy fantasy stories, and I think if you're somebody who's a fan of cozy fantasy, you'll like this one. And if you find you typically are a little hesitant about cozy fantasy because you usually prefer more in-depth world building, or you like your fantasy stories to feel more fantasy, there's more magic and mythical creatures, this has that present as well. So I think that it has a lot of appeal depending on the kinds of things that you look for in your fantasy. I actually think it can fit in a lot of different subgenres. Now getting to that time I got drunk and saved a demon. This is fantasy romance. Certainly, there's a lot of explicit scenes in this. I believe it was previously self-published and then got picked up and was released early at the beginning, I want to say, of this year. And it was not for me. However, even though it wasn't for me, this is one of those instances where I still found it pretty funny, and I still kind of appreciate a lot of what the author was doing, which I guess technically I say that about books even when they don't work for me fairly often about other things. But this one, it was like, I kind of wanted to like it, but it really wasn't for me. That said, if you're curious, you're like, what even is this? So the setup for the story is you follow a woman whose family is in the spice trade, and her name is Cinnamon. And her friend, who is really into cheese, her name's Brie. So that already gives you an idea. Brie's not even really like an important character. I just want to throw that out there. So you already get an idea of the humor within this. And our main character finds herself whisked on a journey with a super hunky demon man after helping him, not realizing he's a demon, but then pretty quickly discovering that this goddess that has existed and has ensured that this entire group of people is safe from demons, it turns out maybe she's actually the bad guy. And so our main character ends up sort of getting caught up in his quest to save his people. This book was fantasy romance while also making fun of fantasy romance. It sort of took the best of both, I would say. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna still be this because I want to be, but I'm also gonna be self-aware about it, and I do enjoy when books are very self-aware and they own it. So all the things that we have found to sometimes be, at this point, almost tropes or cliches within the subgenre or genre, however you categorize fantasy romance. Certain things like the extremely casual way of talking. That was so notable in this that it was obviously intentional, and it was funny. It was pretty, like, right away from the start, I was laughing at the way in which the character thinks about things, the way the narrative is written, how they talk to each other. And there's also as an example, there's a scene where our main character, it's pretty insta-lovey, and our main character is like, I hardly know you, so, I mean, what's even a reason for me to be with you? And the guy thinks about it, and he's like, I mean, I'm pretty packin'. That wasn't his wording, but I swear it was more, I don't want to say it, that's really what it comes down to. I don't want to say what he said, because I'm trying to still keep things PG, but it was even, like, more on the nose than how I'm wording it, which was, it was funny. Like, that's what I mean, because, you know, we see that in, like, the guy's always, like, the most massive man in every way, including, downstairs, and this character, was kind of funny to have him be like, I don't know, because, like, and I thought that was pretty great. I appreciated that. Again, it's not for me, though. The story was, like, bare bones, whatever you needed the fantasy elements to be to fit this plot line that was primarily just, let's just build up some tension and then have the characters do it and be really explicit about it and, like, you know, enjoy a good spanking. And so I'm just thinking about Quest for the Holy Grail right now. But she's just like, oh yeah, I'm into this. That's what this was, which is fine. If that's what you're looking for, then that's what this is. But while I found it funny, it's ultimately just like, you know, I'm not going to keep going. There are others. There's, like, one that time I yeeted a potion at I don't remember the full titles, but they're all really ridiculous. So the title alone probably gives you a good idea. A tiny bit, like the tiniest bit, it reminds me of, if any of you have watched What We Do in the Shadows, which is, like, so aware of its own stupidity that I laugh at it. It sort of has that flavor to it, but I ultimately am not really that, I don't gravitate toward we're mostly just hitting story beats until characters are doing it with each other, and let's see how many fun and creative ways they can do it with each other. That's just not really what I'm looking for. So yeah, this was an interesting one to pick up. Anywho, The Bright Sword. Can we get less like the previous book? I don't know if we can. So The Bright Sword, if you don't know, is by Lev Grossman, who I've never actually read anything by. I've heard a lot of generic things about the magicians, but I've tried to avoid any specifics because it's something I've considered reading at some point, and I would say I'm definitely more so considering it after reading The Bright Sword. I don't know if they're alike whatsoever. I can't imagine, because The Bright Sword is a King Arthur retelling. I know people can be, one, pretty tired of retellings, so I get it if you're like, pass. But second, I definitely find that people, when it comes to King Arthur retellings, have certain criteria they feel it is important to meet in order for them to have an enjoyable reading experience. So I would encourage looking at the author's note for how he chose to go about writing this, so that you have the right idea for just how quote-unquote accurate it's going to be versus how much is going to be new, how much is going to be fantasy, how much is going to be more historical fiction. I think that the author's note is going to give you a good idea of that. That said, I had very complicated feelings for this book, in that, as far as an enjoyable reading experience, I don't know that I can categorize my feelings as I was reading as that, but I didn't dislike it by any means either, and I really liked a lot of the themes that we touched on. This to me felt like a combination of Joe Abercrombie and Andrzej Sapkowski. But I'm not necessarily saying it's like the best of both worlds. And I'm not saying it's the worst of those authors. It just had pieces of the storytelling and the humor and the bleakness of things that reminded me of Abercrombie's work, specifically First Law and Age of Madness, and then the Witcher series by Sapkowski. I think the historical fiction feeling also is part of what made me think of those other authors, but the amount of times that I would tab things just because they were funny, because I wouldn't categorize the entirety of the story as funny. It's actually pretty serious a number of times, or it seems very reflective quite often. But that said, it still had moments that when there were scenes that were amusing, or somebody would say something, or the narrative would articulate a certain thought, I found myself almost taken aback by it because the juxtaposition was part of what made it funny. As an example, one of the characters comes from a civilization that is much more advanced than Camelot, and when they arrive at Camelot, it's very clear to them that they are meant to be wowed by this place and these people. So they sort of play the part, even though it articulates it's kind of ridiculous that the most impressive thing to these people is this table in the shape of a circle. And the way in which it was worded, I laughed out loud. I just found it to be kind of snarky from time to time, and I appreciated that. That's not the main focus of the book. That's just one of the reasons why I think it reminded me of Sapkowski and Abercrombie just a little bit. I do think, though, that the themes are where this book shined, and specifically the almost short story format we get with certain characters. So the way that it's structured is you have a young man named Colum who is determined to become a knight. He feels that this is his destiny, and so he is headed to Camelot. He's heard all about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. That's where he wants to go. And upon arriving, he discovers that Arthur is dead, and the knights that are remaining are kind of like the leftover sidekick ones and not the cool ones. And he is disappointed by this, but also he doesn't really know what to do with his life, so he finds himself just sort of getting swept up in their story, or what even is left of their story. And from there, while that is the present day plot line, you also are getting to know more about these knights, and they are considered sort of the lesser known knights. I did really enjoy their stories. Once again, to tie it to the connection to Sapkowski specifically, I think for me, the writing that I like the most about the Witcher series, because I am a big fan of the video game, I think it's the best version of The Witcher, but within the books themselves, I actually really love the short stories. I think that Sapkowski writes them so well. And in this particular book, that was the part that I enjoyed the most. Just getting to know these people, getting to see their motivations, getting to see what drove them, getting to see what they were running from, not necessarily literally, but emotionally, metaphorically, the things from their past that they didn't want to confront, the things that their family members did that they feel guilty for, even though they had nothing to do with. I just think we tapped into a lot of things that were really well done within those sections. And as a result, though, of this way of telling the story, of going back and forth between this present day column plotline to the other side characters getting some spotlight within these, like I said, almost like short stories, it did make for a kind of odd reading experience, but I didn't dislike it by any means. For those of you that like Hyperion, it kind of reminded me of that also a little bit. I'm so sorry to just be throwing out so many really well-known and for a lot of people well-respected works, because I don't want anybody to go in and be like, this isn't as good or anything like that. But there are just pieces of this that were reminiscent in my mind to some of these other works I've picked up. The reason that I am highlighting so much the themes being the thing that I appreciated is that there's just so many of them that we can talk about. So with Arthur in particular, there is this idea of, because of the nature of how he was born and what happened to his mother, it really sees that character in a different light than what we've seen from this character in the past. I've not really found a King Arthur story that depicts his struggle, and he's not even really a character in the book, but you still dive into him that much. So the idea of your entire existence is something you feel guilty for, I thought that was phenomenal. I also think the very nature of these knights being left behind and then trying to figure out what to do next, because it is historical fiction and because there is so much connection between these knights and the idea of being inspired by something divine, I think that this book tackles something that I don't see very often in fantasy, which is this idea of the hubris that can come with deciding that you have some higher power on your side. This idea that everything you're doing, it must be a sign. It must mean something. And you start deciding that everything is some kind of holy intervention. And this is definitely, okay, I thought before, but no, this is a clear sign. And it's a thing that happens constantly. And you find yourself being almost irritated because you're like, take a second to realize that maybe this was just a thing that happened, but they continuously do that over and over and over again. And then the second anything goes wrong, then there's this mentality of, wait, I must have sinned. I must be being punished for something I did. What is it I did that is leading to this horrible thing? And it's just interesting the way that these characters frame everything. And it almost creates this sense of an unreliable narrator, but this collective unreliable narrator, which I thought was kind of fascinating. And I've not really seen that before either. So I enjoyed that element of it. You also find smaller scale themes whenever you focus on individual characters. You see a lot about self-worth, you see a lot about identity, you see a lot about trying to conform to an environment that you're not accustomed to. So there is a lot that is packed into this, and I wouldn't say there's any one specific thing that was maybe more significant. I think the previous one I mentioned, the reason that I spent some time on that is purely because in the present day narrative throughout, that is kind of such a strong thing, and then you'll see that in those little pockets of different characters' stories. Plot-wise, though, despite the fact that I enjoyed all those other things that I have been discussing, the plot is everywhere, and there's every little magical thing you can think of stirred in a pot, and just random scenes will happen where, okay, now this is an angel in this scene, and then there is some kind of fae in this scene, and there's a giant in this scene. It just kind of gets thrown at you, and sometimes you're even questioning, is this real? Is this, I think this isn't real. Okay, this wasn't real. Was that other thing real? Did that person die? Are they still alive? It really makes it feel slightly disorienting at times, in a good way. It's not so disorienting as to be dense. I just think that it makes you feel like truly any magical thing is possible. But the plot is not necessarily one where you have a set purpose and you're striving toward that, and then you feel good when you accomplish it, or you feel gutted when they fail. It wasn't really quite like that, and I don't know that I can say I was particularly attached to anything or anybody. I kind of was just watching a lot of things unfold, and I sometimes enjoyed what was unfolding. I sometimes enjoyed the humor of it. I sometimes enjoyed the themes, or sometimes I found what was happening to be kind of sad, but I didn't have a strong connection to anything. It was a very strange reading experience. Upon completing books, I do always strive to determine the best way to talk about the book to all of you, as I want to ensure that however I describe the book is an accurate reflection of what you're going to get, so that you can determine for yourself if it sounds like something that you want to pick up. Because I value your time and your money, and I want you to find the books that are going to bring joy in your life, fulfillment, enrichment. And I do feel a little bad because this book is, for me anyway, it's just so hard to describe in a way that is somewhat contained and that really represents it well, because it's just so many different things. So I don't want to dissuade people from picking it up, and I don't know that I necessarily am recommending it or encouraging you to pick it up. I think the best thing I can say is that it was definitely a really unique reading experience for me. There was a lot of complexity to it. I think there are so many different things that you can really dive into and pull apart and pick apart and have such interesting, fascinating conversations around, that I guess in a way I am recommending it, but I could also see it not working for a lot of people. So apologies if you feel like you heard so many things but also simultaneously heard nothing. I just think that it was different from a lot of what I've read, which is interesting because it's one of the most classic fantasy stories that comes to mind. So many things are somewhat inspired by the King Arthur legend. So it is kind of interesting that I had a really unique reading experience that I don't know how to capture or describe very concisely for something that is known and established and has been done so many times. So I guess bravo to Lev Grossman. I don't know. It was just so different. If you do pick it up, I would be curious to know if you felt similarly. Of course, maybe let's keep things spoiler free in case anybody glanced at the comments and hasn't read this book just yet. But anyway, that's it for some new fantasy releases, and of course you can let me know your thoughts on the other works as well if you've picked them up, and if you are interested in picking any of these up, if you have not yet, feel free to let me know. And based off the things I've mentioned about these books, do you recommend The Magicians? Do you think that, oh, it sounds like it's totally different? Also, feel free, if you've read any of these books and you feel like there are other ones that people, if they like this, then they might like something else, feel free to leave those recommendations too. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.